Welcome to Underworlds from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Mark Shaw. In this episode, I'm talking to Deborah Bonello, and Deborah, who's a member of our network, has written an extremely interesting book fitting in a particular and growing genre about women in organized crime. It's called Narcas, The Secret Rise of Women in Latin America's Cartels. Deborah has worked for ages in the region, talking to people, and when you read the book, as you'll see in the interview, she draws out the stories of a number of key women mob bosses or crime bosses, and it's really a very, very interesting account. Over to the episode.
Deborah, it's an absolute pleasure to speak to you. And obviously I've read a copy of your book and I picked it up in a Miami bookstore and it's a signed copy, which I was very happy to get. And it's a fascinating book with lots of characters. Actually, that struck me reading through it. It's an easy read, but there's people coming up, women coming up throughout the book. A good way, I think, to start is, would you mind describing some of the key characters, why you chose them, two or three, just to give everybody a sense of what the book is about?
Sure. Well, the first woman who came across my radar was really Guadalupe Fernández-Valencia, who is the highest ranking woman known today in the Sinaloa Cartel. And I came across her because, you know, the Chapo trial, which was rolling out in 2018, 2019, was super high profile. At the time, I was the bureau chief for Vice Latin America, and we were covering that a lot. And I noticed that there was only a single woman's name on that indictment. And so started looking into her. At first, I thought, oh, well, maybe no one's written about her because there's no information about her. But then as I looked, I found that her entire criminal history was on pacer. And, you know, Guadalupe was in her late 50s, early 60s by the time she was arrested. She looked like your sort of classic Mexican grandmother. Nothing eye-catching about her. She didn't really fit into these stereotypes about, you know, that kind of have defined how we understand women in organized crime. You know, the mob wife, the trafficked victim, you know, the girl with the golden gun. Like, she was none of those things. And when I started digging into her, I found she had, you know, migrated undocumented to the US in the late 80s, early 90s. She got into drug trafficking in California. She did her time there and got sent home. You know, hers was sort of a very typical sort of migrant story. Not so much the drug trafficking conviction, but just the, you know, this movement between Mexico and the US. And yeah, and then she got back into it after her brother, who was working with Chapo's family, got arrested, and then she got pulled in, and everything was there. So I sort of started digging into her. And when I was talking to people in the US about her case, someone else told me about Digna Valle, who was a Honduran trafficking matriarch based on Honduras's border with Guatemala. She was arrested in 2013 and subsequently sort of helped bring down her entire trafficking clan. You know, the DEA at one point was very focused on Honduras and its role as a major cocaine transit hub in Latin America. And again, Digna was in her late 50s. She was the eldest of 13 siblings. She totally, again, looked like a grandmother, like not someone who you would look twice on the street or suspect of being involved in the cocaine business. And so those were really the two cases that brought me in and started having me question sort of what our understanding was of women in organized crime. And, you know, by that time I'd been in Latin America for about 15 years, working for, you know, newspapers as well as think tanks like GI-TOC, Insight Crime. And I had seen that are sort of the visible women were very much, the sort of Emma Coronel type women, who is, those who don't know, Chapo's wife, young, very pretty, she's sort of this sort of archetype of mob wife.
So Deborah, this is the big message of the book, right? I mean, how would you summarize it comes through very clearly, but just summarize it in 2 sentences. We've discounted the role of women in organized crime, no?
Yeah, the book is about how women are generally sexualized and minimalized in organized crime.
And why, Deborah? Is this, part of the thing I get is because it's men looking at organized crime is one issue. There's not, is it as bad as in some ways the book portrays?
My feeling is that because organized crime is so shadowy, we are a little bit behind generally in terms of our understanding of it. And like if we look at things like banking and football and tech, you have seen in the last 2 decades, women very much rise to the top and come to the forefront. So I think it's natural that it would take us a while to notice that in organized crime. But yes, I do think there's a male lens to the way that organized crime has been documented, which is a tendency to minimalize and sexualize women who are there. They tend to be discounted because they're, the wives or the mothers or the sisters. But, organized crime in Latin America is absolutely clan-based. So men are brought in to organized crime in the same way as women are, via marriage, via blood ties. And men tend not to be minimalized for being brought in that way. So it seemed like very much a double standard to me. And so in the book, I argue, if we sort of take off this lens that we've been using that sees women as victim and sees women as, co-opted and sort of forced into things, then we have a clearer understanding of their role within these clan-based organizations.
Deborah, what's amazing about the book is that the woman seems so ordinary. I think you used the word earlier, granny, like this lady is like your average granny, but clearly to survive in a kind of criminal milieu, she kills people, she traffics drugs, this is like a really tough business. But the women you interview are both very ordinary, but there's something I quite tough about them, I suppose, that emerges. But it's this weird mix of these two things.
I think in part that's surprising because we have been so conditioned by the sort of legend and bombasticness of organized crime, by the narratives that we see in mainstream media, right? So you look at Narcos Mexico, you look at any of the coverage of sort of, mob run New York. You have these larger than life male characters, who are sort of the biggest and the toughest. And I think that's very much kind of trained us into how we understand people in the drug trade. And really, for people like Digna's family, for example, these are very humble, poor agricultural parts of Latin America where, there are these porous international borders. Digna's family started off as cattle contrabandistas, smuggling cattle across the border. And then, they realized they can make $800,000 for every ton of cocaine they move across the border. So it is kind of like a financial no-brainer. But like these people are not, the Scarfaces, the sort of people at the top of the chain. But also I think it kind of emphasizes how there's such a plethora of people and roles and ranks in organized crime, and that what we see in terms of the sort of, the Hollywoodification of especially the drug trade is really just the sort of tip of the iceberg.
Deborah, you recount this very interesting story actually from a research perspective and from a personal perspective, sort of how you began. You met a professor who had written a book or actually made contact with you. I mean, when you began writing it, did you know how it would end up? Or did you sort of gather, did the case that you put together just grow stronger and surprise even you? Because it's a very powerful read. You finish it and you do, in some ways, have a different lens. You have the sense, there's a set of characters that are missing, or have been missing for many of us working in the area.
I think I always knew that I wanted it to be based on this perspective and, you know, suggestion of a new narrative in terms of how we're looking at women in the drug trade. You know, part of that was personal in the sense that I've covered organized crime for 20 years in Mexico. I'm usually one of the few women in the room. And there does tend to be, you know, when I told people in my field what I was doing, the assumption was, oh, you're writing about the wives. Oh, you're writing about the girlfriends. Like this idea that no woman would be there were it not for power being passed or shared.
And what was your answer to those questions? No, I'm not, or don't be crazy, or...
I mean, my answer to those questions was that's why we need the book, because people are still understanding women based on that assumption. And for me, you know, the issue of agency is really important, because I think there has always been this idea that when women are there, they're there because they didn't really have much choice. You know, this idea that women could be ambitious, strategic, violent, just seems still in this day and age, even though we have seen, you know, women's role in traditionally male-dominated fields like football and banking excel. I think there is still this kind of fundamental discomfort with seeing women who are mothers and, you know, the family nurturer and the base also being kind of delinquent and bringing their kids into the drug trade and sending out hits on people. I think that's something that people find really fundamentally uncomfortable about that still. And so, you know, it just felt like, you know, part of the book is data-based and I did a lot of research, but it's also a very, as you said, like it's a very personal take on some, you know, a field that's just been dominated by these very sort of stale narratives for a long time.
If you haven't read the book, Deborah recounts sort of making connections, making interviews, her own questioning and thoughts. And there's some funny bits in here too, Deborah, if you don't mind me saying. I think of your journey through writing the book. So it is very personal, which makes it very readable. Deborah, just describe, because I think a lot of people, I think the question people ask a lot around these sort of true crime books, which are also analytical, is, well, how did you make contact with people and how did you make them talk? And you give some hints in the book, but talk us through that. I mean, how do you make contact with powerful women, organized crime figures? Do you appeal to the gender argument as you would for a business executive, or, you know, what's your line in, I suppose?
The criteria that I used to choose the women who I focused on was a lot based on access. So I decided to focus mostly on women whose cases were going through the US justice system. Because in the Latin American justice system, it's very hard to get hold of court transcripts, indictments, and like any documentation that helps build scenes and really kind of understand the case. And also I wanted to focus on women who were no longer key in the criminal landscape. You know, I live in Mexico City, I work in Latin America. I had no interest really in poking the bear next to me. You know, like I am very kind of practical about risk and try to sort of not be too, you know, the risks I take are very calculated. I don't think anyone wants to cover a story they're not going to come back from, you know, because then you just don't get to write it. But it was also based on, like the access issue. So some of the women I did have access to, and, you know, Marixa Lemus, who was a sort of part of the narco-political nexus on the border with Guatemala and El Salvador. She was a sort of a smaller time player than, say, Guadalupe and Digna. But I did get in to see her in a high security prison in Guatemala. In the end, I ended up doing it via a nonprofit that works with women in prison who were very sort of neglected and invisible. And I knew that asking the Guatemalan government for an interview with the woman who has the moniker of being Guatemala's version of El Chapo, I knew it was very unlikely they were going to give me access to her. And then for all the other women who were, at the time that I was writing the book, were mostly in either the US penitentiary system or awaiting deportation after having done their time, some of them responded to my letters to speak to them. Some of them had their hands tied because if you are convicted in the US of a crime and you're a foreign national, you're automatically tagged for deportation. If you want to stay, you need to convince an immigration judge that you deserve a special visa for that. And immigration judges who, as we know, immigration is such a hot political potato right now in the US, but they don't look kindly on former female traffickers bragging to journalists about their criminal exploits. So a lot of the women at the point that I was writing the book just didn't really have an interest in speaking to me. If anything, they were going to disadvantage themselves from speaking to me. And this is why I chose cases that had a lot of documentation around them. So a lot of the reporting was based on sometimes speaking to the women, corresponding with them. In the case of Digna, I went to her town and I spent the day there with women who knew her and speaking to people who had worked with her and her family, prosecutors, immigration lawyers, people who were kind of in the periphery of the world of these women as well. And just kind of, innovating a little when you can't actually sit down and speak to them. But I have to admit, there was some frustration for me because I did feel like I really wanted to speak to Guadalupe and Digna about what that experience was like for them. I don't know whether I would have sort of intellectualized the concept of gender as much with them in the sense that they're not coming from a world where it would necessarily have been political or gendered for them. I think a lot of them sort of came up in a world where it was like, yes, they could have said no and not chosen to get involved, but I don't think it was a feminist act, if that makes sense.
Did you make a gender? I just out of interest, did you? Because sometimes when you're trying to interview criminal figures, you say, well, you need to tell your history. I mean, you're trying to appeal to people's ego in a way. That sounds terrible, but I think it's true. You have a story to tell. Will you tell it to me? Were you making agenda arguments or that wasn't your? Did you say, look, there's a story about women in organized crime that isn't being told, and I'm trying to tell that?
Yeah, I did.
And what was the response? People, would you say?
The response was no response. And then after the book came out, I was contacted by, I don't want to name names, but some of the women reached out to me and were not terribly pleased about the coverage and about the attention. And I think, it's hard, Mark, to really generalize about women in organized crime, but my feeling was that the majority of the women didn't like the attention. They don't want to be immortalized by Netflix. They just want to kind of sink into the woodwork and disappear. There were some exceptions to that, but that was my finding generally. And there was an indignation on their part that I would have the audacity to, put their cases out there. Without necessarily the understanding that, if you are convicted on drug trafficking, your story is kind of fair game, because all of the information is public. So,
do you think men are different, Deborah? Can I ask? Do you think do you think people would have more of an ego?
I mean, I think men and women come in all shapes and forms, right? I could never speak for all women, just as you could never speak for all men. I think there are so many different types of personalities and egos in the way that we approach this. I think, if I can make some regional comparisons, if you look at Colombia now and you look at Mexico, Colombia is a lot less violent than in terms of its organized crime landscape as Mexico. And Mexico, it hasn't quite gotten the memo that violence brings attention, right? It brings heat from the government. It brings press coverage. It has all sorts of ramifications, even though it is also a useful currency in the forms of, generating fear and compliance and getting people to do what you want. And I think we all as individuals make those decisions. And I think some of the women were more violent than others. Some of the women enjoyed having the kind of power that allows them to be these significant pawns in their communities. And other women just kind of wanted to enjoy the money from organized crime and not be sort of on the front of the newspaper. So it varied a lot.
Deborah, can I ask a serious question, which I thought about a lot, sort of interviewing and writing people myself, and I Do we, I'm not saying you did this, actually you've got a very good balance, but just generally your view, do we run the risk of glorifying people? So one of the attempts is to humanize people, right? There's actually a older woman, she's a grandmother, etc. In this process of covering them, I mean, do you think there's a risk of glorification somehow?
I think that one of the tensions in the book was, I was impressed by the power that these women had acquired of themselves without glorifying it, because, they are essentially working for viscerally violent organizations. But I do, after covering the drug trade for 20 years, I do try to stray from this sort of American DEA narrative about organized crime in Latin America, which is based on a lot of kind of black and white narratives. These big, mostly brown criminal groups are forcing now, especially with the opioid epidemic, illicit drugs onto America's, innocent young white kids. And I think ultimately the drug trade is a product of capitalism. It is a consequence of grinding poverty. And the people who are drawn into it are not these one-dimensional, nasty, bad men who, are just kind of trying to ruin America's youth and what have you. I think that the drug trade is extremely complex, but it is a symptom of the world that we have created for ourselves. And these, the way that the organized crime again is represented in mainstream narratives, you would have us believe that the men and women leading these organizations are just terrible people with no capacity for having their own families and having relationships. All they want to do is generate harm. And I just think it's infinitely more complicated than that. And part of the book was trying to create a nuanced and multi-dimensional understanding of the women who get involved. Yes, they're traffickers, but they're also mothers and matriarchs and sisters. And, they're part of these rural communities that in some ways really looked up to them and admired them. And they're also benefactors. If you go to Sinaloa and you talk to people about Chapo Guzman, a lot of people will tell you that he was a hero to them. And he has been buying poppy paste and marijuana off impoverished farmers for decades and filling the void often left by the role of the state in Latin America. So I think all these factors make the people involved much more interesting and nuanced than traditional narratives might allow for.
But it's interesting you say, the reason we thought of doing the series, which means I have to read a lot of books on organized crime, which is good, is there's such a growth in the number of non-fiction books about, let's say, illicit markets, criminal groups, etc. Some of them academic, some of them in the sort of non-fiction, true crime. Some of them a mix. I would say yours is a mix. I mean, what should sort of non-fiction books achieve in this area? What should we aim to achieve? Is it to achieve that more nuanced overview as we go forward? There really is, I don't want to say an explosion, but at least as we see it, an increase in the number of studies, books in the area. What should we be looking to achieve in your view?
I mean, I'd be interested to hear your view on this, Mark, actually. And, I think, if as we look at what we've seen roll out in terms of the drug war in my region in the last, 5 decades now, I think even someone from the DEA will tell you that the drug war cannot be won. And this kind of simplified idea of good against bad, the evil drug lords trying to profit off the death and suffering of America's youth. Humanity has been trying to alter its state of consciousness and numb pain since it was created. So that the prohibition model and the kingpin strategy, I think we all know, are having a very limited impact on, destroying the drug trade, and certainly in some ways generating ever more violent environments. As you take out these leaders, be they male or female, you create power vacuums, and then violence kind of explodes as fractured organizations struggle for power. So the point of the book, and like what I think that we do need to see more on, is less of a punitive kind of understanding of how organized crime is tackled and why organized crime exists. This idea that people are just bad, and to understand that for most people it's a social and economic opportunity. I think if we can understand that and like take less of a kind of stigmatized approach to it, and understand, for women especially, when women are put in prison for low-level drug trafficking crimes, which has, the female population in Latin American prisons has mushroomed in the last decade, they are often either taking children in with them or leaving children on the outside. The loss of those primary caregivers has a fundamentally different impact on society as those kids are impacted by their incarcerated mothers. So, and I think a lot of people would argue, well, if she was trafficking five kilos of marijuana, why shouldn't she go to jail? And I'm like, but it's such a small, tiny drop in the ocean. Is that really going to, take away the drug trade? So I think we need to just kind of have some new ideas and thinking. And my hope is that by creating a more rounded, nuanced picture of things, we might start having some new ideas. I was in Southcom in Miami towards the end of last year, and spoke to, people who are going to be the future decision makers in Southcom, which is the part of the US military that executes a lot of kind of anti-narcotic strategy in the region. I was in a room of 50 people. One of them was a woman, Jamaican, amazing woman, and the rest were guys. And after the presentation, they were like, well, what do we do about this? How do we solve this problem? And for me, it was like, I feel like it's not about having a single policy approach. Like, this kind of thinking has to permeate all of the thinking around anti-narcotics, or creating incentives that, instead of punishing, sort of discourage, more preventative, less punitive, in terms of understanding the dynamics that drive people into it in the first place.
And you think, Deborah, I know it sounds like a strange response, but to go back to the question, a flowering of research, nonfiction on this provides nuance. You think the people in Southcom read? I know they read. I guess, would they read this?
I hope so. I mean, I certainly sold a lot of books. I certainly sold a lot of books that day, but the book has actually been twofold, because we were talking before about your autographed copy. I've done a lot of appearances at book festivals, and I think there's kind of people who are readers who just enjoy having their minds expanded and thinking about things in a new way. I do hope that there is sort of a more academic and law enforcement side of the world that's consuming the book, because I do think that in the world in general, the world, we are what we see, or we see what we are. Like, the way that we perceive and conceptualize problems is the way that we approach and attack them. And I think that might sound a little bit kind of esoteric in terms of what we're talking about, but I do think, if you walk into a room and it's your belief and understanding that women are pawns in a man's game, you're really not going to ask the women many questions or any revealing questions, and I think we have to kind of disrupt the way that we're approaching law enforcement and documentation around this issue. And that comes from sort of picking up the snowstorm and shaking it, right?
Yeah, but is that another question on identity? Does it matter that you're a Brit? In a way, I know you've been there a long time, right? You're like an insider, outsider, I'm guessing, right? Is that helpful? Is that a hindrance? Do people want Brits asking them question in Latin America? I mean, does that make you more objective, or does this make no difference at all?
I think being a foreigner is a protection in a way. As you know, Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. And that is, you know, sadly, a wave of violence that is mostly affecting Mexican journalists, not foreign journalists. So I think being foreign does afford me some protection. I think it's also, you know, I was born in Malta, brought up in the UK. I can't say I belong to like any one nationality. And I was always one of those girls that never really fit in with what was expected of us, you know, and like that kind of conditioning, as you know, starts very young, gender-based conditioning about how you should be in school, what you should wear, what you should be doing with your time. You know, I was always...
And you say some of this in the book, actually, Deborah. That's why I'm getting at it. So just to tell people listening.
Yeah, so I think I was always used to being a bit of an outsider wherever I was. And I think that kind of life experience also kind of makes you naturally question, like, well, why are these expectations and what are the alternatives? So I think having grown up as kind of something of a mixture of lots of different cultures and places, I think that helped bring my perspective. And, you know, I mean, we are now living in a world where a lot of people are not born and, you know, they're not born and dying in the same place. Like migration is now endemic. But certainly when I was growing up, I was more of an outlier. You know, most of the people that I would be with are people who were living where they were born and they were going to stay there for the rest of their lives. So I'm grateful for that experience. But I'm also, you know, I think one of my anxieties about publishing the book was, am I going to get pummeled for it? You know, because I think part of it is questioning the status quo. But I do feel like it's been very gracefully received and like has been kind of absorbed as part of this existing literature and like a new perspective in this existing literature. And it was never written with the intent of everything we know is wrong and I'm right. It was more like, well, let's just try and expand this a bit and take a slightly different approach to how we're seeing women in the game.
What would you say is, I mean, I really love the book. So this is more to explore about how you responded. What was the most critical thing anyone said to you about the book?
There was this idea that it could have been more sort of data driven in terms of
just from academics or what, Deborah?
Yeah, and like I think I really focused with the profiles. I really focused on trying to get very personalized individual ideas of these women rather than doing sort of very sort of data-based analysis on, you know, how many convictions have there been for high-ranking women in criminal organizations. Like, I didn't have the means really to do that kind of statistical analysis. You know, yes, there are studies about low-level women, you know, for low-level trafficking offenses in prison, but a lot of the high-ranking women are kind of, you know, hidden in those government stats. But I actually stand by it because I think this isn't really necessarily a data issue. Like for me, it was more about trying to understand what the individual dynamics of those women were and what drove them into the trade, and try and use that as something representative for women as a whole.
Well, Deborah, can I just turn to two last sets of issues? The first is how you write. I think people are always interested in this. This is really a tightly argued. You're a journalist. You write a lot. You've written for us. You know, how did you put this together? Because actually, it's stories. They go back and forth, but there's this narrative that flows through. How did you achieve that? I mean, do you work for long stretches and throw away a whole lot, or did you get frustrated, or did you just bash it all out in 2 weeks? What was the process?
I'd say, I mean, the idea I had probably 3 years before I handed in the first draft. So there was a lot of sort of thinking and research, but the writing probably took place over about 6 months. I was working for Vice at the time. I went down to a 3-day week. So I was working that time. And, you know, writing, like I would say, you know, 30% is actually putting words on a page. And then the other 70% is messing around with that and adding to it and editing yourself. And I was convinced by my agent that I had to put myself in it, and that there is a lot of me in it. And that felt very unnatural to me. Like I had been a reporter by then for more than 20 years, wasn't very used to writing in the first person. And certainly, I have to admit, I had a slightly kind of grim view of the journalists who like put themselves at the center of the action. So that was a real challenge.
A grim view because this is self-promoting or what?
So that there can be this kind of like tortured self-importance sometimes in the way that we see journalists place themselves in narratives. And I was terrified of that. And I didn't want to be the reporter who like made it about her. So it did feel like a minefield. And I very much wanted my analysis to be something that helped kind of enlighten or juxtapose the experience of those women with who would be probably the typical reader. You know, the people who are typically reading Narcas are not people who are like the women in the book. They're probably people who are more like me, you know, who have led a lot more of a pedestrian life than sort of getting into the drug trade at the age of 15. So that was one of the challenges, especially there's a chapter in there about the beauty culture around women in the narco business and how Emma Coronel, Chapo's wife, has essentially spearheaded this movement of women in Sinaloa and in other parts of the world who you know get surgery to empower themselves in a way that associates them with that world, right? So like you're not necessarily a narco wife, but you look like one, and that means, you know, people assume you have status and money and power. And, you know, speaking to women in that world was really fascinating to me because I just come from such a different way of thinking about aesthetics and you know, the idea that you go to a doctor and like have him shape you like that is very much, you know, I mean, that is, I think, generally becoming much more accepted in society, but it's kind of on steroids in states like Sinaloa. And I think social media has really kind of amplified that decision-making process and that lifestyle, which is making it much more aspirational and desirable. And so in the book, you know, in that chapter of the book, I tried to be really honest about my reaction to that without being judgy. You know, it wasn't my intention to be like, again, you know, this is a preposterous pastime and aspiration. Like, why are women doing it? It was more like, it does go contrary to so many of the other tenets of feminism that we're seeing and other kind of understanding of women's place in the world. But at the same time, I think that juxtaposition is really interesting. And it was, the intention was to sort of just create and emphasize the contrast rather than condemn it.
So it's a very interesting part of the book. I have to say, of course, I've read about it elsewhere, but it describes it really well. And you don't pass judgment. I mean, I'm guessing what you think, but you don't say it in the sense, but it tells why and how people do it. And it draws together some of the story at the end rather well about individual aspirations, the sort of consumer, the desire to fit in, what money does, really amazing stuff. Deborah, just to close off, a question from my side around what we're getting wrong, right? I would say we're the biggest global think tank now on organized crime research. We know there's like 90 research projects underway. Are we not doing enough on the gender angle? What should we do more? What are the gaps? Like walking away from the book and your engagement with many people, I think that's always a useful process to get ideas. What more do we need to do? Where are there areas that are underexplored from your perspective now, having done this work?
I think there is a very strong strain of thinking within the perception of women in organized crime, which is that of victim, that women are, and you know, when we talk about young men in organized crime compared to young women, we tend to differentiate between their level of agency. And actually, I think both men and women are pulled into organized crime for the same reasons.
And what is the reason, Deborah, in your view? Wealth, money?
In countries like Mexico, I do understand why the drug trade is attractive to both men and women, you know, especially from the lower social economic stratas. It offers empowerment and money and like a certain amount of status in countries where social mobility is really kind of out of the reach of a lot of people. So I do understand its attractions, But I think this idea that women only do it because they have to or because they're not given a choice is both patronizing to women and then like, you know, also insinuates that men do it because, you know, the way that we perceive men getting into it is different. But actually, I think there's a lot of overlap. And I think, yes, there are, of course, different social dynamics and economic dynamics affecting men and women. But I think we need to kind of be a little bit more open-minded in terms of women's agency. And I'm not talking about blame. And I think this is also part of the problem in the way that the organized crime is documented is like they, you know, people who are arrested or people who are killed in the process of their role in organized crime are kind of perceived as sort of asking for it or being responsible for their own demise. And I'm like, but that's assuming it just sort of takes away the complexity of the decision-making process of getting into the drug trade. And I think we need to sort of move away from the idea of blame and focus more on agency as this very important element to how people get into organized crime in the first place. Sorry, I know that sounds a bit esoteric as well, but like I do think agency is a major factor for women. I don't think it's as simple as I didn't have a choice.
I mean, agency is interesting because what you've done is you tell the story of people's lives, right? And it's I don't want to say the word criminal career captures it, but basically the sense of how people steered and made life decisions and got sucked in and it became much more dangerous and then took choices, etc. And this is very, very interesting. And I think this is just a personal reflection, which is why the book is so interesting. And to respond to your data point is that a lot of academic research is peopleless, partly because it has to be, because it's so hard with university ethics, etc., to do interviews. What this book brings is, in fact, the opposite. It's driven by a set of characters which tell you a story of a kind of missing part of the debate and I guess the bigger research question. So super read, Deborah. Thank you very much for talking and answering the questions. We're going to put a link in the bottom to where you can get the book. We're going to have a lot of other interviews with authors. As I've said, the sort of flowering of nonfiction, which we feel we should try and cover and capture. And of course, the initiative itself carries on doing research in a range of areas and trying to do it in innovative ways to influence policy, but also knowledge about organized crime. Deborah, really a huge pleasure to have you as our first guest on an important issue and an important book. And we are very grateful. Thank you.
I'm delighted. Thanks for having me.